questions from the audience? Yes.
Eustace, you mentioned that the IRS collects the tax money and then they truck it directly to the Federal Reserve banks in their respective regions.
That's right.
Of which there are 12.
Yes.
How do they account for all of this? Are they ever audited so we know exactly how much money went to the Federal Reserve Bank?
No, there's never been an audit of the Federal Reserve System. And I believe this is one reason that the congressmen are so anxious to audit the Federal Reserve to find out how much of this tax money that is being extorted from our citizens is actually getting to the government. And this is a very important point, because when the IRS comes after you, they want every penny, and you as a citizen should find out where every penny of that money goes. You have a right to that information.
Well, you're saying that the Federal Reserve Bank is controlling, was it the fiscal administration of the money system?
Well, the actual fiscal administration through the Department of the Treasury is controlled by bureaucrats who themselves are appointed by the President of the United States as part of the executive department. And of course, the President of the United States, his campaign is always financed by the Federal Reserve banks themselves. In other words, if you want to run for office, you are not going to get any money from the bankers, because they only give money to their own candidates. And of course, they give money to both parties. That's a tradition. So that shows that they're nonpartisan, you see.
So again, we really don't know how the tax money gets back to the people.
We do not, absolutely not. That is a process which has been shrouded in as much secrecy as the actual deliberations of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors itself. And this is so important to throw light on this, and people are beginning to realize. You see, for so many years they didn't even know the Federal Reserve Board was there, so why would they ask any questions about it? Now, in the last 10 years, there has been much more public awareness about the fact that we do have a Federal Reserve System. Now we have to ask the question, what is it doing, and what is it doing to us? And these are the questions which are beginning to be asked in Washington, and I think we're going to get some answers one way or another.
Well, why can't Congress have the IRS audited?
Well, the IRS itself, apparently, because it is a tool of the Federal Reserve Board, is not really a government agency, and no one knows how to go about having it audited because they don't know exactly what it is.
Okay, so neither the IRS nor the Federal Reserve Bank are part of the government.
No, they're not. Although when I sued the IRS, I had to sue the Commissioner of Internal Revenue at the Department of the Treasury building. The IRS offices are in the Treasury building. I might mention about my forthcoming book, The Rape of Justice, which is an expose of the legal monopoly and which recounts a number of my lawsuits. I have handled my own lawsuits for some 40 years. And I was in a lawsuit against a man who had tried to kill me, rammed his car into me, and then of course he wouldn't pay. And so I sued him. And his lawyer, who was a very prominent lawyer, told me one day, we had legal maneuvers for about a year. We'd gone through what they call pretrial discovery, depositions, and all this sort of stuff. And I had filed a lot of motions myself. And so, and I'd also sued his lawyer along the way. And so this lawyer stopped me one morning as I was going by his office, and he said, Mr. Mullins? And I said, yes. He said, and I kept walking. I didn't want to talk to him because, you know, I only saw him in court. He said, I just want to tell you something. I said, what's that? And he said, well, you're not going to be a problem to us much longer. And I said, well, why do you think so? He said, because the IRS is going to take care of you. And I said, I have no problem with the IRS. And he said, well, you do now. So the next day I got a letter summoning me for an audit. So I promptly typed up a lawsuit and filed it against the Internal Revenue Service agent for $350,000, charging him with terrorism because I was terrified. I mean, you know, being summoned for an audit is a terrifying experience. And so I thought since I'd been terrorized, I had grounds for a lawsuit. So I filed suit against him, and this, of course, I don't think anyone had ever done this before. And it caused consternation in their offices. And so when I went in for my audit, of course, they knew all about the lawsuit. And I took 2 friends with me and a tape recorder. And I'm not very mechanical, and I didn't know how to work the tape recorder, so I set it on the desk, and I kept trying to turn it on. I didn't know how to turn it on. So anyway, the agent was just staring at the tape recorder. He wouldn't look at me. He kept staring at the tape recorder as though it were a bomb or something. And so these 2 friends began to argue with him. I sat back and let them, he said, "Who are these people?" And I said, "They're citizens of the United States." He said, "Well, why are they here?" He said, "I summoned you." And I said, "They're here because they are interested in what goes on here." And then this lady, she was quite truculent. She said, "Well, you know, I pay your salary." And the agent shot back. He said, "Oh, no, you don't. You don't pay my salary." And she said, "Oh, yes, I do." And so they were hammering away, and I was just sitting back and enjoying the whole thing. So finally, the agent's supervisor stepped out. He had been hiding behind the door, if you can believe this. He'd been hiding behind the door. He stepped out from behind the door in this conference room, and he said, "Well, the audit is concluded." And I said, "How could it be concluded?" I said, "I was summoned here to talk to you about my tax situation." He said, "Well, I'm declaring it over." And of course, we had also argued about the tape recorder. They claimed that you could not have the tape recorder there, and this lady jumped on him and said, "Yes, you can have the tape recorder there." And so after about 20 minutes of this, he said the audit is concluded. So then a few months went by, and I got an assessment for a deficiency.
Did you drop the lawsuit?
I kept the lawsuit. I filed it in state court because I was a citizen of a state of Virginia. They promptly remanded it to federal court, and I filed an 18-page memorandum citing the U.S. statutes that it'd be remanded back to state court. And we carried this on for about a year. So finally, they got it dismissed without a hearing. But during that time, I filed 38 motions, including 11 motions for an injunction to halt the collection of all income taxes in the United States until these important constitutional principles of my lawsuit had been resolved. Well, of course, they didn't want to halt the collection of all income taxes in the United States. So they never heard my motions, and they finally dismissed the suit without a hearing. Shortly after that, I got a notice of deficiency. So I filed with the U.S. Tax Court. And because of my unique personal history, when I first visited Ezra Pound in 1947, because he was under indictment for treason by the Department of Justice, the FBI opened a file on me, and I remained under daily surveillance by the FBI for 33 years. So after some years, about 1982, a friend of mine in Chicago said he had applied and gotten his FBI file. And he said, "Why don't you apply for your FBI file?" And I said, "Why? I wouldn't have any FBI file. I've never been arrested in my life." And so he said, "Go ahead and send in for it anyway." So they answered my inquiry, and they said, "Well, yes, we have 800 pages. And so I said, "Send it to me." And they said they'll charge 10 cents a page. But they said, "We can only send you 500 pages because 300 pages of it would endanger national security if it were released." So I appealed this, and they had a board meeting at the FBI, and they agreed that yes, this 300 pages was so dangerous that it would imperil the national security of the United States. So I never got to 300 pages, but I got to 500 pages, and in that 500 pages was a record of this surveillance over a period of 33 years. And also there was a letter from J. Edgar Hoover, a memorandum, to the 4 top assistant directors of the FBI, ordering them to see to it that I would be placed in a mental institution. And so then they had about 30 pages of memoranda about how they were chasing me around and trying to get me committed to a mental institution. I knew nothing about it at the time because I had left my apartment in Chicago and gone to Michigan. Russell Kirk, a friend of mine, had lent me a cabin in Lake Mecosta, Michigan, to write my biography of Ezra Pound. And of course, I was always very secretive about my movements, and I got in my car and drove off to Lake Mecosta without telling anybody. So at that particular time, the FBI had already successfully conspired with a county judge that 2 agents of the FBI would pick me up at my Chicago apartment, take me before this Cook County judge, and he would commit me to an insane asylum. So it was all planned and would have been executed just that way, except I wasn't at home when they got there. So when J. Edgar Hoover heard this, because he had issued a direct order, and it's initialed by him, I have this reproduced in my book, A Writ for Martyrs, which also reproduces 120 pages of my FBI file. And so the fact that he had personally ordered me picked up and committed, and then when I wasn't home, the agents had to report back to him personally that they couldn't find me, which would, of course, put them behind the 8 ball. And so then he decided that someone had tipped me off, because I had a close friend in the FBI, not an agent, but in the bureaucracy. And in fact, I stayed with him when I was in Washington, so for a number of years. So J. Edgar Hoover decided that I had probably been tipped off and that I was so angry that I was going to come to Washington and kill him, because they had repeatedly stated in my FBI file that I usually carried a gun, which was totally untrue. I hadn't owned a gun for years. But they also said I was a very sloppy dresser. And so I had to add a lot of other stuff in there, too. It was really interesting reading. That's why I reproduced 120 pages of it, because it makes a good book. So, and I would like to find out what's in the other 300 pages, but unfortunately, that 300 pages, after J. Edgar Hoover was found mysteriously dead in bed, his secretary burned all of that file, so I'll never find out what it was. But J. Edgar Hoover, when he decided I was on my way to Washington to kill him, issued a national alert for me, and they had FBI agents watching every airport and railway station and bus station in the United States. And so they didn't find me. So finally, through a fluke, they found me at Russell's camp, because a friend of his had gone down to Chicago to see the symphony, and I said, why don't you stay at my apartment and pick up my mail? So when he drove up behind my apartment in the alley there and went upstairs to open the back door, he came back down, and about 30 FBI agents jumped out of the dark with drawn guns and flashlights in his eyes, and they were all screaming, "Where's Mullins?" And so he told them I was at Lake Mecosta, because it was no secret. And so then they rushed off, and then he looked in his car, and they had taken his keys, because they thought it was me, you see. And so they had grabbed the keys immediately, so that when I came back down, I wouldn't be able to make my getaway. Of course, how I could get away with 30 FBI agents shooting at me, I don't know, because this was only 2 blocks from where they shot down John Dillinger at the Biograph Theater. And of course, that was an execution. When he walked out, they simply filled him full of lead. And they probably would have done the same to me, I don't know. So anyway, when I went before U.S. Tax Court, I had this file, and I filed a number of legal motions before the tax court, including a stipulation that the court recognized that the FBI and the IRS had for years been engaged in an illegal conspiracy to have me committed to a mental institution. So I went down for my hearing after about a year, and I chose to have it heard in Richmond, Virginia, which was closer to me, although I could have gone up to Washington to the main building.